So when it comes to anything Francis does, I think that there's three main positions you can take. The first one is what I like to call the Pope Francis Defense Force. And these are the people who will come and say, well, technically, if you read in detail what it is he said and you interpret it in the light of tradition, and you go back and look at this document from the Council of Trent or this subsection from 50 years ago, and you have a theology degree and a reference book, then everything he said was actually based in traditional and there is nothing problematic about it at all. The second category is the people who don't have theology degrees and don't spend like hours reading through these documents. And if they read it at all, they will skim through it. They'll read summaries. They'll maybe read a newspaper article, or they'll just read the title. And these people will interpret this as, yeah, no, Pope Francis says same-sex relationships are okay. Same-sex couples are okay. Civil unions okay. Maybe even gay marriage is okay. And that is the impression that they will take away from it. So you have maybe like the 1 to 5% of people who will say, oh, it's just out of context. It's Pope Francis is just vague. Maybe if we want to be charitable, he has Alzheimer's, he's schizophrenic, he's really dumb, he's surrounded by people who can't write, something like that. And then there's the people who interpret this as what it looks like on the surface, which is the Pope is tacitly giving his blessing. Now, the third position, the one I hold to, is somewhat more nefarious than the previous two. I maintain, and I've maintained this for a long time, that Pope Francis is a massive gaslighter. You see, what he does is, and I think this is like, I don't think you can really argue this point at this point. I don't think this is speculation. I don't think this is tinfoil hat stuff. I don't think this is me being like crazy or conspiratorial. Is he will deliberately word things in a vague way, or he will do a speculation, or he will have like a statement, but then like at the end there'll be something saying like, oh, but actually no, or something like that. Or better yet, he'll get his surrogates to come out and make statements like this and imply that he supports them without actually saying that he supports them. And so the goal is to have implausible deniability while at the same time giving the impression. So do I think that the Pope actually supports same-sex couples and civil unions? Yes. I think he objectively does by any real measure, because this just keeps happening. Like every couple months, we get some sort of document that comes out that's super vague, super weird, and it's immediately interpreted by everybody to say that Francis is supporting a specific thing. Clarification is never issued. Everybody just interprets it in that way. And I think that's deliberate. I think what Francis wants is, like I said, to have implausible deniability. He wants people to think that the church has changed its teaching while having this like legalistic thing in his back pocket where if someone calls him on it, he can just say, oh no, well, technically, if you read the fine print, I didn't say that. It's also a way for people to foist the blame on liberal priests and liberal bishops and lay people who do a bad job catechizing or evangelizing. And this is something that a lot of trads do, is they will just attack priests, they'll attack bishops for teaching bad things. And to be fair, that is 100% true, and they deserve to, but at the same time, they're just doing what their boss is telling them to do and what their boss's boss is telling them to do. Like, ladies and gentlemen, let's just live in the real world. What Francis is doing is what he's always done. What he's done since the first day he was Pope. He is giving the impression that he's making reforms to the church while leaving a weasel backdoor as a way out if he gets called on things. So does the Pope actually personally support all these things that like he issues statements on but leaves the little asterisk at the end? I think he does. I think pretty much everything that the media has reported that he supports, he actually does support. He just knows that he can't directly say it, or he wants to leave the out so that he can get the Pope Francis Defense Force to back him up. So he will make it slightly vague. He'll be like, well, I think same sex couples is a beautiful thing, and I appreciate the love between two people, and it's a sign of like true Christian brotherhood. But technically, a marriage between, and he'll just add that at the end, and it'll just be mumbled, or it'll be like an asterisk, or be a footnote. But like, it's clearly by issuing this, and he's done this multiple times, he is saying, yes, you're allowed to bless same-sex couples. Yes, the teaching on the church's teaching on this has changed, and I just think that's objectively what it is. And we can cope about it, and we can say it's the media, we can say it's liberal priests and stuff like that, but it's not. It just isn't. This is Francis gaslighting you and just trying to do it. And people can say I'm being uncharitable or schizophrenic or a conspiracy theorist or something about it, but no. Like, I gave him a pass for the first 2 years of his papacy, and after that, it's like, how does this keep happening? Does he not have like? Are we supposed to like think that he's retarded? Every single person around him is mentally deficient. None of them read newspapers. None of them scan the internet. Not a single one of these people has looked at these statements and gone, you know what? We have this problem where people keep misinterpreting things. Maybe we should be more clear. That doesn't seem to have ever happened. Do they issue clarifications? I don't know. Maybe they do, and I've just never heard of them. The sheer number of coincidences, misinterpretations, and stuff like that you would have to have for this to not be deliberate is just, it's astronomical. I just can't do it. I can't live in Copesville to that extent. I'll say it again. Pope Francis supports same-sex couples. He just does. This has been brought up so many times. It's like Stanley in The Office. It's like, did I stutter? It's like, he's like, no, I support it. Did I stutter? But then there's like an asterisk that says, oh no, marriage is between a man and a woman. And I mean, this is the world we live in. And I had an interesting experience the other day where I went to confession, and something at my work is I had to do some stuff that was associated with a charity that was trying to promote transsexualism to kids. And I felt bad about that. I wasn't directly doing it, but I was like indirectly involved just because my workplace was. So I told the priest, I'm like, look, I feel bad about this, Father. I feel bad that I'm indirectly involved in promoting this. And he said, well, being trans isn't a sin. Promoting trans stuff to kids isn't a sin. You have to stop imposing your values on the rest of society. We live in Canada. We live in a secular society, and you have to respect the viewpoints of other people and not assume that you're right and they're wrong. And it's like, okay, is that heretical? Probably. But like, how much can I blame him when his boss and his boss's boss basically is telling him that? Like, the expectation of some of the people is that, I mean, and I've said this before, it's ignore what the Pope says, ignore what the bishops say, ignore what your priest says, ignore what Catholic media says, ignore what the mainstream media says, ignore what politicians say, and just read this like 200-year-old document that takes priority and look at subsection 5 of paragraph 10 and you believe that. Believe some just random dude on the internet with a theology degree instead of believing the Pope, instead of believing the cardinals, instead of believing everybody else in a position of authority, is more or less like what we're supposed to. Now, I'm kind of in a weird position, and I've always kind of been in a weird position with regards to the church, because I'm not particularly pious or particularly conservative when it comes to like liturgical matters or stuff like that. Like, I don't really associate with the traditionalist movement. I'm not like a huge Latin mass guy. I have a very, and I don't know if this is my learning disability or my bipolar or whatever, but I have a very low, what would the term be, affectation for aesthetics. Aesthetics really just don't really matter that much to me. So like ceremony, ritual, stuff like that, it just doesn't really, it's just not something I particularly care about. Obviously, I want mass to be reverent. I don't want clown masses or anything, but it's not something I've ever really cared that much about. So, and just kind of some of the other aspects of Catholic culture and things like that. It's just not something I've ever really been into. And so I'm kind of in this weird position where I'm politically similar to those people in like my social conservatism, in my general belief that society should be run along Christian principles, but I'm not exactly in when it comes to like liturgical stuff and things like that. So when stuff like this happens, I'm always never really sure what to think because my like emotional loyalty to the church is not nearly as strong as any of these people's are. Like I go to mass because it's a responsibility and I think the sacraments are real, but I don't particularly enjoy it. I don't particularly get much out of it. I'm not someone who is really affected by aesthetics or something like that. That's not to say I don't believe in Christ. I don't believe in salvation, all that stuff. I just don't have a particularly strong tie to a lot of it. So I'm just always kind of in a weird position when it comes to this, as I never really know how to feel about it. There's been lots of times I've thought of leaving, but I think the good thing is when I converted, I was extremely cynical about where the church was. I thought it was in a state of like disaster and crisis, and I wasn't really expecting that much. Now Francis has gone like way below my lowest expectations, but I find a lot of people when they convert, they have a lot of zeal. They tend to be traditionalists. They love the Latin Mass. They love all the church's traditions, and they come into it expecting the church to be like that. And then when they're faced with like the practical reality of what Francis is like, what the bishops are like, and to a large extent, and what their local priest is like, they go to mass and he tells them that you have to accept trannies, that as the one priest in England said, you have to fight, you have a Catholic duty to fight right wing nationalism, you have to accept immigration, you have to do all this stuff, that Jews are like better than Christians, that ISIS is not as bad as like the Catholic Church, all of this stuff. When they go there and they hear that, they're like, well, that's just the one bad priest. And then they go to a bunch of other churches and they're like, oh, okay, that's not, maybe not the majority, but it's a loud vocal minority. In a lot of cases, the bishops will support them on this. And it's like, well, but like once again, how can you blame them if their boss is telling them that? Like the whole system is based around papal authority, and the Pope believes in same-sex relationships, and he believes in same-sex in civil unions. So, like, how can you really be angry at the priest who told me that no, it's okay, and you're like basically a bad person, and maybe that's an exaggeration, but you're just wrong for thinking that there's something wrong with telling kids to cut their dicks off when his boss is saying that or making that implication or doing it in that Jesuitical way where he gets his surrogate to say it, or he says something that is easily interpretable that way and then doesn't qualify it and then never issues a follow-up statement. That is basically where we're at, and I'm just trying to be real with you guys. Now, how do I feel about this? What am I going to do? I don't know. It's kind of a case where my expectations are so low just because I've been going to like the churches I've been going to for years are pretty much mostly horrendous. And I've mostly had ultra liberal priests who have said all kinds of crazy stuff. So I'm kind of used to a lot of these things. And it makes me deeply depressed and sad, but I don't think it hurts me as much as it hurts a lot of people, particularly something I come across a lot is people who come from red states, particularly rural red states, and they have a decent church. Maybe it's not even a trad church, but they have a church with like a relatively conservative priest, and the people around them are relatively conservative and share their values. And I don't think they all, like, even if they're from a blue state, they might be from a conservative area of the blue state, and they just don't like understand what it's like to live in Canada or to live in like areas outside of like where they live in a red state. And they don't, they're like, well, just go to another church. And they don't get it. Like, if you want to go to a church that doesn't suck in Canada, It's unless you're very lucky, you're going to have to drive like 40 minutes. It's just going to be a complete and total mess. And even then, it's only so long until that priest gets rotated out, and then you're screwed. And maybe there isn't even one in the region you live in. And you're going to have to listen to constant homilies by people who think Pope Francis is the greatest pope of all time and espouse all of the things that he does. And those are the people I find who most often will leave the church more so than me, because I've gone through lots of periods where I want to leave or I stop going to mass or something like that. But I've never just completely left and started going to another denomination. I find over the years, a lot of the people who have criticized me for not being a trad, for not doing the rosary enough, or reading the lives of the saints, or just being pious enough, a lot of those people, I find when they're faced with stuff like this, they just kind of crumple. A lot of them have become sedevacantist or atheists or have converted to orthodoxy or something like that, and they just can't take it. In my case, I'm just used to it. I mean, this is just the way things are. What am I going to do in the long term? I don't know. It's a hard place to be because I do believe in the sacraments of the church, but I do think this is objectively what Francis believes. And we can do this thing about he doesn't have the power to change it or not. But for all practical purposes, he does. And for all practical purposes, this is what he is teaching and this is what he is propagating. And this is now the official position of the Catholic Church. And we can live in Copesville and we can pretend that that isn't the case. We can pretend that it's fake, but it isn't. This is what Francis is promoting. This is what the church teaches now. He has the backdoor way to get out of it if he gets called on it, but he's a weasel, he's a snake, he's a gaslighter, and he is the worst pope in history. Like if I wish he was Alexander the Sixth or whatever is whichever Alexander he was. I wish like the worst thing we had to deal with was that Francis had a couple like hot young Italian side chicks. Like I could deal with that a lot easier. It's like, okay, that is a sin and that's bad, but that's at least understandable. That doesn't undermine the church's teachings. It makes him maybe a bad person, but it's not the same thing. Maybe he's like super gluttonous and just eats and he's super fat. Like that's not. Once again, there are sins that are animal sins and sins that are diabolical sins, as C.S. Lewis put it. Animal sins are just things that we all suffer from being human. They're things like lust. They're things like greed, gluttony, laziness, stuff like that. It's just something that, as part of the human condition, as part of being a mammal, you have to deal with. And these things are bad, but they're understandable. They're understandable. It's like you have a lot of kings throughout history who were very devout, but they also just had a lot of sex with random women. And that's not good, but I can understand that. And I can understand how someone could be devout, but also kind of do that. Once again, I'm not supporting it or saying it's okay. I'm just saying that's understandable. And then there's sins that come from a corrupt will. And pride is that, envy's that, stuff like this. Gaslighting people and basically deliberately trying to lead people into hell and perdition. So you can look like Mr. Progressive, so that you can look like a big man. And you can go down in history as like the Pope Humble the First, who is the one that saved the church from the evil of Benedict and the evil of the traditionalists. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. He's a really, really bad person, and I don't see how there's any way around it, to be honest.